If you search bizarre afterlives of dictators, what happened to the bodies of infamous tyrants, or the strange fate of history's most feared rulers, one unsettling pattern appears again and again. The deaths of men like Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, Vladimir Lenin, and Joseph Stalin didn't end their stories. In many cases, their bodies became symbols, political weapons, or eerie relics long after they died. Some were preserved like museum artifacts. Some were hidden. Some were stolen. And in a few disturbing cases, the treatment of their remains became almost as shocking as the lives they lived. Because when tyrants die, their power doesn't always disappear. Sometimes it changes form, and sometimes the strangest chapter of their story begins after death. Imagine standing in a quiet archive room somewhere in Russia. The lighting is dim, temperature carefully controlled. Shelves hold sealed containers labeled with numbers and dates from another era. Inside one of those containers is something so small you might miss it if it were lying on a desk. A fragment of bone, piece of jaw. And yet, that small object may be the only confirmed physical remnant of the man who launched the most destructive war in human history. The remains of Adolf Hitler. But the story of how that fragment ended up there begins in the final hours of Nazi Germany. Berlin, April 1945. The Third Reich is collapsing around its leader. Soviet forces are closing in from every direction. The once grand capital of Hitler's empire is now a city of rubble and fire. Deep beneath the Reich Chancellery sits a bunker of reinforced concrete. Inside, Hitler has become a shadow of the man who once dominated Europe. His hands tremble. His voice has grown weak. His empire has vanished in a matter of months. But there is one thing he refuses to surrender: control over how the story ends. Just days earlier, the world had seen the humiliating fate of Benito Mussolini. The Italian dictator had been captured by partisans and executed. His corpse was taken to Milan and hung upside down in a public square while crowds gathered beneath it. The images spread quickly across Europe. Hitler saw them, and he made a decision. That would never happen to him. So on April 30th, 1945, he gave his final instructions. After his death, his body must be burned. Completely. No remains. No display. No humiliation. Inside the bunker, Hitler and Eva Braun retreated into a private room. Moments later, a gunshot echoed through the concrete corridors. When aides entered the room, both were dead. Their bodies were carried outside into the shattered garden above the bunker. Gasoline was poured over them, and as artillery shells exploded nearby, the corpses were set on fire. At least, that is the official version of events. But when Soviet troops captured Berlin, they were not satisfied with the story. Joseph Stalin demanded proof that Hitler was really dead. Soviet investigators began digging through the ruins of the bunker garden. Eventually they found something: burned fragments of bone, pieces of skull, and a jawbone with dental work that matched records from Hitler's dentist. The remains were quietly taken to Soviet laboratories. But the Soviet government kept the discovery secret. Even their allies weren't told the full story. That secrecy created a vacuum. And into that vacuum poured rumors. Stories that Hitler had escaped to Argentina. That he had fled to a secret base in Antarctica. That the body discovered in Berlin was a decoy. These rumors spread across decades. Entire books were written about them. But then in 2009, scientists examined a skull fragment long believed to belong to Hitler. The results shocked historians. The skull belonged to a woman. For decades, the most famous supposed relic of Hitler had been misidentified. Today, the only confirmed remains tied to him are fragments of teeth and jawbone kept in Russian custody. For a man who attempted to build a 1,000-year empire, history preserved almost nothing. But compared to what happened to Mussolini, Hitler's fate almost seems calm. Because when Benito Mussolini died, the story became something closer to chaos. April 1945. Northern Italy. The fascist leader is fleeing toward Switzerland disguised among German soldiers. But partisans recognize him. He is captured. And the next day he is executed by firing squad. His body is transported to Milan. That's when something disturbing happens. Crowds gather around the corpse. Years of war, propaganda, and suffering erupt into fury. People spit on the body, kick it, strike it with sticks. Then the corpses of Mussolini and his mistress are hung upside down from a metal beam at a gas station in the city square. The images shock the world. Thousands gather beneath the bodies. But the strangest chapter comes later. In 1946, fascist loyalists secretly break into the cemetery where Mussolini had been buried. They dig up the body, wrap it in cloth, and steal it. For weeks, the dictator's corpse disappears. Authorities search across Italy. Eventually, investigators discover the remains hidden inside a monastery. The monks had been convinced to protect the body. Even in death, Mussolini still had followers willing to risk prison for him. Eventually, the corpse was returned to his hometown for burial. And even today, visitors still come to see the grave. Some out of curiosity, others out of admiration, which reveals something uncomfortable about the afterlife of tyrants. Even after they die, their bodies can still influence people. That strange relationship between power and death reached its most unusual form in the Soviet Union. When Vladimir Lenin died in 1924, Soviet leaders faced a difficult decision. Lenin had become the symbol of the entire communist revolution. Burying him felt almost like burying the revolution itself. So they made an extraordinary choice. They would preserve his body. Scientists were tasked with preventing decay. They experimented with chemicals and preservation techniques never used on a human body before. Eventually, they succeeded. Lenin's body was placed in a glass coffin inside a mausoleum in Red Square. Nearly a century later, the corpse is still there. Specialists inspect it regularly. The skin is maintained with chemical treatments. Humidity and lighting are carefully controlled. Millions of people have walked past the preserved body of Lenin. Some see it as a tribute. Others see it as eerie political theater. But the story became even stranger after the death of Joseph Stalin. When Stalin died in 1953, the Soviet government placed his body beside Lenin's in the mausoleum. Two of the most powerful figures in Soviet history lay side by side. Visitors filed past both corpses. But politics changed quickly. As the horrors of Stalin's purges became widely known, his legacy became toxic. Displaying his body beside Lenin became unacceptable. So in 1961, something unusual happened. Late at night, Soviet officials quietly removed Stalin's body from the mausoleum. There was no ceremony, no announcement. The corpse was buried behind the Kremlin wall. It was almost as if the government wanted to erase him from public memory. But history rarely allows that. Because centuries earlier, another ruler experienced an even more bizarre fate. In England, the corpse of Oliver Cromwell was literally placed on trial. Cromwell had ruled England after the execution of King Charles I. But when the monarchy returned in 1660, the new king wanted revenge. Even though Cromwell had already been dead for 2 years, his body was dug up, brought before a symbolic court, and found guilty of treason. The punishment was shocking. The corpse was hanged, then beheaded, and the head was placed on a spike above Westminster Hall, where it remained for more than 2 decades. People walking through London could look up and see the skull of a former ruler staring down at them. It was meant as a warning, a message to anyone who might challenge the monarchy again. And yet, even that strange story isn't the end of the pattern. Because modern dictators have experienced equally bizarre afterlives. When Nicolae Ceaușescu was executed during the Romanian Revolution of 1989, many citizens refused to believe the dictator was truly dead. Rumors spread that the body buried in the grave was not actually him. Some believed he had escaped. Others believed the government staged the execution. The rumors persisted for decades. Finally, in 2010, authorities exhumed the bodies of Ceaușescu and his wife. DNA testing confirmed the truth. They had been buried there all along. But the conspiracy theories lasted more than 20 years. Because sometimes, people struggle to accept the fall of someone who once seemed untouchable. And then there was the strange ending of Muammar Gaddafi. In 2011, during the collapse of his regime in Libya, Gaddafi was captured by rebel fighters. He was killed shortly afterward, but instead of immediate burial, his body was placed in a refrigerated warehouse. For days, crowds lined up to see it. People filmed the corpse, took photos. They needed proof that the dictator who ruled Libya for decades was really gone. Eventually, Gaddafi was buried in a secret desert location. The grave was deliberately hidden. The goal was to prevent the site from becoming a shrine. But the secrecy created new rumors. Some claimed the burial never happened. Others believed the body had been moved. Once again, death failed to close the story. And that's the strange pattern that appears again and again across history. When tyrants die, their bodies rarely disappear quietly. They become symbols, warnings, mysteries, relics. Sometimes they are preserved like monuments. Sometimes they are hidden to prevent followers from gathering. And sometimes they vanish entirely, leaving historians to argue about what really happened. Because the afterlife of a tyrant is rarely peaceful. Long after their regimes collapse, their presence lingers. In glass coffins, in secret graves, in fragments of bone locked away in archives. History often tells us that once a dictator dies, justice is complete. But when you examine what actually happened to many of their remains, you realize something unsettling. Death didn't end their influence. It simply changed the way that influence appears. And sometimes, the shadow of a tyrant grows even longer. After they're gone, there's a lot more they don't want us asking about. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.